Hi, and welcome to today's episode of Beyond the Ballot. Today is a very special episode because we have three people with us instead of the usual two, and someone will be co-hosting with us.
We have Samir Chalhoub, we have Sandra Melhem, we have Miquel Bibiloni from Spain. So we have a Lebanese from the diaspora, and we have a Lebanese within Lebanon. So first, I'm going to talk to Samir. First, if you can give me a small kind of historical background of yourself in regards to the LGBTQIA plus community and your activism in it.
Thank you very much, Ayariwa, everyone. I'm very happy to be with you tonight. Briefly speaking, I'm in aid and development policy expert focused on civil society development. This is something I've started doing in Lebanon in itself for about 8 years. And I recently moved to Eastern Europe, to Ukraine in specific, to continue doing the same job within a different and very fascinating context. And being a member of the LGBTQ community myself, I find it very exciting in general to have to continue resisting a couple of oppressive policies and institutions and systems, especially with the 2019 October Revolution. I also had the LevantX.com online publication, which is all about as well human rights and geopolitical awareness and information. And we have a very significant contribution going specifically and written by LGBTQI plus members in general. So that's my contribution for now. Very small, I am aware of that. But in general, my focus is mostly on policy and institutions and systems.
As we just drew the contrast between the queer community before and after 2019, I would like to ask this question, especially in regards to the revolution and the change that it brought about in the local queer community. Samir, back when this happened, were you in Lebanon?
That was one of the moments that I will remember for a long time, when the revolution in itself did create a space for protest, for activism, and for a very confident voice coming from the queer community. And we have seen on the streets, and in specific represented in tents and organization sessions taking place, and dialogue and discussions, absolutely peaceful, taking place, in Beirut downtown, led by queer voices and the LGBT community in general. So we've seen representation of NGOs focused on LGBT, etc. We've seen marches, feminist marches. We've seen the pride flag in the revolution. And all of these, as much as it was countered by the opposing voices in general, this is absolutely necessary. And it was about time that this community in specific is represented in every spectrum of the entire anti-corruption movement that has been going on for years and continues to be the case today.
Sandra, as an activist based in Lebanon, how do you see 2019 as a point in time that has brought about any change for the queer community in Lebanon?
For me, what happened with the revolution is that the queer, for the first time, I think, in the history of the country, the queer community actually had a lot of visibility, because at that point, you couldn't deny the fact that there was that there is a very big queer community, and that for the first time in a very long time, they were on the streets, extremely present, extremely loud. So basically, for me, one of the most important things that came out of the revolution, people were not able to deny anymore the fact that there are queer people in Beirut, and that that there is actually a huge number, and that they actually can make a difference. And that was shown on the streets. Like Samir said, there were pride flags. There were a lot of queer activists during the revolution for a very long time. So I think for me, that's the silver lining that came out of the revolution. The fact that the entire country as a whole realized that there are queer voices, even if they don't necessarily agree with them. So you had people who were watching the news and local news channels that were seeing on their TVs that there are queer voices in this. So they were no longer able to just brush it off as those people don't exist.
Did the increased spotlight on the queer community also increase the risk in any way?
Anna, for me, the risk is the same. If anything, the risk is less, because there's unity in numbers at the end of the day. we can't just look at the explosion as a separate event. You have the economic crisis at hand. You have the pandemic. You have a bunch of factors: economical, mental, emotional well-being just spiral downwards. In the case of the queer community, of course, you have an extra layer, which is the fact that automatically, when you're going through an economic crisis, if you are queer in a country like Lebanon, you're not the first people would consider hiring or consider opening up their doors to, because because at the end of the day we are put on in a way on a hierarchical kind of thing. So what we did with the Queer Relief Fund was we wanted to focus on the queer community, because we knew that at some point a lot of people were going to be overlooked, and a lot of queer refugees were going to be overlooked, and trans people and people that perhaps are not comfortable going and asking help from heterosexual NGOs or whatnot.
I think also Sandra quite highlighted the fact that indeed the visibility coming on that was shed on the LGBT community in Lebanon prior to 2019 was concentrated to a certain degree towards the cultural and entertainment scenes, whereas in 2019, during the revolution and onwards until today, even not only the queer community participated and strongly in that change and in that evolution in the chain of ideas, etc. But they demonstrated that they're also part of the political process and part of the political change in the country, and they are a voice that cannot be excluded by anybody who doesn't wish to see them part of the conversation. So I think there was lots of determination on the ground from this specific community that today is very difficult to challenge. And this is one of the reasons why, despite all of the collapse that the country is experimenting at this stage, the queer community will find a way to thrive. And we continue to see, specifically in different scenes, including the drag scene, we continue to see, and I think Sandra is one of the first witnesses of that as well, we continue to hear of new names, new talents, new opportunities. And it's coming at a high cost, of course, because now it's becoming much more difficult to do things in Lebanon anyway. So we need to keep in mind that despite all of these limiting factors, this community is here to stay, and not only is here to thrive as well. And also, speaking of drag in specific and their presence in the everyday discussions, I would definitely with the support that is coming from allies like Sandra, for example, Sandra could also bring a perspective, in my opinion, on how there is a big correlation now between the drag movement and the ongoing political evolution of the country. So maybe Sandra, you could also bring your thoughts on that.
Listen, when it comes to the drag movement and the entire movement as a whole here, if we even want to look at the history of what happened in Stonewall and all those places, trans people and drag queens were always at the forefront of any queer movement that actually snowballed into anything. So if definitely with the rise of the drag scene and it becoming very mainstream, of course, thanks to social media and Netflix and RuPaul and all those things. For me, as long as the drag scene keeps progressing, it means there is progress that's happening also on the ground in different ways, whether it's from awareness to visibility to even challenging heteronormative ideas of people that come to a drag show for the first time, and all of this automatically leads to action when it comes to political change. At the end of the day, you know, when you're changing a mindset or just exploring or showing some people something new, you're automatically shifting how they're thinking, so that hopefully there would be something that shows at the end of the day somewhere.
Have there been any challenges that are still faced by the drag community in Lebanon?
Yes, of course. At the end of the day, it's still somewhat illegal to be to have a man address as a woman in the country. The term in Arabic is خلب الآداب العامة, which is a breach of شو خلب الآداب العامة?
The public
ethics, morals. Yeah.
Samir, is this legally wrong? What is considered the criteria to خل بالآداب العامة?
It's actually very personal, right? It's very personal depending on the witness. So like the law enforcement officer on the street, for example, it's very, very personal. And that's the problem. That's the gap in the law. Even the law 500.
534. Yeah, even Article 534.
It's also very, very subjective, right? It depends on how the judge and how the police officer or the law enforcement officer or investigator would take the case. So either they are personally, empathetic, understanding, and they would disregard completely, the case from a moral point of view, because also what is moral and what is immoral, that's also a big debate and a big spectrum, right? And I think there's been some wins in recent years from judges being like, this is not our business, what men, who does what in general with their personal convictions. And that could also be used as a good example. Some judges leading the process, some lawyers leading the process as well, when it comes to making this law in specific more scientific than moral.
Yeah, because Article 534 says that any sexual act that is against nature is prohibited by law. So what's happened in the past couple of years is that there were a few judges that said that it's not really against nature for two people of the same sex to actually have intercourse. But again, like Samir said, it's very personal. So it's the same with the drag scene. It's very subjective how it's handled. But what we do is we watch our back. So we take drag as a form of theater at this point. We have very strict rules on the queens when it comes to things they need to address. So we have rules that for example, say the queens can't. There's no nudity. They don't really speak about religion in an insulting way. We tackle political issues, but we're not very direct about them. It's in a way to cover our backs, because at the end of the day, the law is very blurry and you don't know really. You might have somebody that's very open-minded about it, and then you might have a police officer that might come and just put everyone in jail.
If I remember correctly, Article 534 basically targets homosexuals, but the way that it phrases things is a bit ambiguous, because then they basically prosecute what they consider acts against nature. And then that is completely up to the judge's interpretation of it, because then if the judge does not consider it against nature, then it is not against the law. And then the person would not be prosecuted. It completely depends on the judge's subjectivity of the interpretation of this law.
For the drag scene, it's not related to Article 534. Article 534 is solely for intercourse if you are caught red-handed, even to a certain extent, or in the act. For the drag scene, it has nothing to do with that article. It's a completely different thing, which is the breach of ethics, which is we are encouraging men to dress as women and to behave in a feminine way. And again, because we're in a patriarchal society and that's seen as something frowned upon, that's where the drag issue goes into. It's not hand
do
in
we
hand with
have
Article
any
534.
official code that is being violated?
No.
Like, do we have a code about what is considered acceptable as a human behavior, or in this case, manly behavior?
That's a very good question, Dua, because at the end of the day, the laws are here to back the Lebanese constitution. And the Lebanese constitution in itself actually enshrines the right for freedom, of expression and belief of any Lebanese citizen in general and residents of Lebanon. So that means the impression that you give to society in general with the way you dress falls under freedom of expression. And that being said, you're free to express yourself the way you want, including the way you dress, right? And then this actually could deny or could simply counter the already existing laws that are very broad against. So they were never made to target specifically the drag scene or like LGBTQIA plus community, but have been used as an additional charge to cause more harm and more restrictions on this particular group in general. So in fact, we could what can be associated as immoral back in the time when Lebanon inherited the laws from the colonial system actually links, for example, to zoophilia and necrophilia, for example. These would be considered, when drafted, some of the immoral acts of sexual intercourse, and really does not refer to same-sex intercourse in general, or relationships. But, however, have been used with the progression of patriarchy, has been used to oppress queer communities at certain instances. And again, as very well said previously, it remains very subjective, which means that awareness works, because when you change people's perspectives, it means that, even if the law is there and it's very blurry and we don't want to, and it's difficult to repeat it, but then it becomes very personal, right? And this is why it's very important for the Bar Association, the lawyers in general to unite, judges to unite, and for this whole awareness to keep going within the country, because it's working. We've seen wins.
Has that set a precedent? So basically, the new change in the way that judges have been perceiving the article that we have just discussed. 534. The
Absolutely.
Judge's perception to Article 534, and the way that has set a precedent to what is considered normal or abnormal behavior, or in this case, now the fact that it is considered normal behavior. Has that set a precedent for further cases?
Absolutely, I think it's the case. And also the the year is not on top of my mind, but when there was a military court case, when
2 years ago, I think 2018.
Yes, so when it was a military court where you expect, it might be even more strict on these matter, the judge completely dismissed the case, saying, "I have nothing to do with what these men are doing in their, in their free time." So, it sets, I would say, a good precedent for other cases to follow, and also the statistics that are not necessarily so prevalent and present. This law in specific is not used and could actually be used in case of, for example, as an added charge, for example, for men or women or trans people who are engaged in sex work and have been arrested. And then if it happens that the sex work is being between, two people of the same sex, this could be added as an additional charge on them. Or
it's never the main charge.
etc. Like it can be added and piled up as an additional charge. But it was never a case. Never is a big word. Yeah, it might have been the case. But it's rarely the case where you're simply arrested for having a partner that is of the same sex, which is already quite promising for the Arab region in general and for the Middle East as a whole.
Like now we're seeing how the whole community is progressing throughout the society, throughout its political work, its judicial work. And Miquel is one of the Greens of España. And he's
not España, Catalonia.
Catalonia.
No, I'm joking.
Catalonia.
It doesn't matter.
But it is true, though. So you're one of the very few new queer community people who are sex workers, as are part of the Greens in Catalonia. Yeah. So can you tell me more about what happened throughout the progression of being able to reach this level now? What happened before? How receptive were people before? What helped you throughout your journey to reach this level of you being able to talk about your work publicly, to be represented, politically accepted within the different groups? So if you would.
Well, I feel like one of the things that has helped me the most is first of all, being integrated within the Green movement. And the Green movement in Europe has always been very receptive about the plight and the struggle of sex workers. So they already had the connection, and they already had presence within the movement, right? I feel like it's especially with the Scottish Greens and the UK Green, the English Greens, right? The English and Wales Green Party. They're very good at their position with sex work, even in France and Catalonia, because we don't have a successful national Green Party. Now it's starting with Más País, it's called, and it was an incision. It was like a splinter movement coming out of Podemos, it got very popular at some point, and it integrates within the Green European movement. But I feel like being a male sex worker has also helped, because there's an implicit hierarchy within the sex worker community, in which female sex workers, of course, are subjected to more abuse online, and they're subjected to like double standards, especially for men, because they're female, right? And females are always expected more of compared to men. So that's also helped, being a male sex worker. That's something that people who are male sex workers cannot deny. And the youth wing, especially the young European Greens as well. I feel like from a European standpoint, they're also very open to talking about stigma and working with sex workers, who most of the time, especially male sex workers, tend to be overwhelmingly gay and bisexual. So there's a connection between the sex worker movement and the LGBT movement as well, especially with trans women as well are overwhelmingly sex workers. So I think there's a connection there. And right now in Spain, we have, as I said before, when we were in our recording, that there was a renewed attack coming from radical feminism that's connected to this like new wave of far right ideology seeping through and seeping into like seemingly left wing spaces. And this transphobia, this new and renewed transphobia and horrorphobia as well has taken root in some aspects, in some segments of the left. But fortunately enough, it's not the majority of people. So now we have to fight a new wave of regressive thought, right? But we're optimistic. We just have to educate the people, and because when you ask people in the street, it's not such a stigma as in Lebanon. But there are still like microaggressions and some things that people hold to be true that are not actually true, and it just comes from a place of ignorance. So we just need to educate the people, I feel. In my case, it's more of an exposure and a growing exposure to have trans people integrated within the higher echelons of the parties, more visible, more proactive, not being only held as tokens, right? Like tokenism. We have to avoid tokenism. And more sex workers as well. I feel like they've been politically involved in the parties because in the young and in Joves Ecosocialistas, which is the youth wing that I'm in, I'm the only open sex worker. And also, like, even in the meeting we guys met at, I was not the only sex worker. I was told afterwards by a person in the altar club that they were sex workers as well, but they didn't dare to bring that to light. So we're surrounded by sex workers. So sex workers are our brothers, our mothers, our sisters, our aunts, our cousins, and they're all around the same way that gay people and lesbians and bisexuals, you know what I mean, and trans. Another thing that I wanted to point out is that in Spain, we don't call it the LGBTQIA plus community because we haven't gotten so far as to the movements are not are parallel, but they go at different paces, right? So in Spain, people wouldn't know what queer is. We wouldn't know what queer is, so we call it the LGBTI collective or community, right?
Okay.
So it goes to show how, because I feel like Lebanon is more in tune with maybe like the UK and the US movements, and they get a lot of information from there. In Spain, it's really, even though society has progressed to the point that we're really in tune with those ideals, we might not even know. We don't talk about asexuals, for example, in Spain. It's not taboo at all. It's just not there.
Yeah,
it's not.
Yeah,
not enough of them have come out.
There's a lack
to talk
of presence there. Yeah,
there's a lack of spotlight.
There's another thing that we talked about. This is very important because it's something that is very logical, but it's very hard for people to actually realize by themselves. Which is when you said that there's an imbalance within the community itself. Yeah. So if you could elaborate further on that.
When we think about the LGBT community, we like to think about it as horizontal, inclusive, and everyone's friends with each other, everyone hangs out with each other. But it's not really true, is it? Like there's difference. there's different degrees of power within the LGBT community, and gay people, especially like gay men, are always at the top of that pyramid, and trans women specifically are at the bottom, because when you talk about homophobia in Spain, everyone agrees with it. No one dares say that gay people have mental issues, right? They have a same-sex attraction because they had issues when they were children, but it's quite accepted in Spain for trans women to be constantly questioned about their identities by other feminists, so-called feminists, and it's accepted as just another opinion. So you can see the power imbalance and how society has progressed differently, because different resources have been allocated to different people. Gay people have monopolized that platform from which they did activism. And up until quite recently, 2 years, it was called the gay pride, right? Gay pride. It was not LGBT pride, LGBTQIA pride or whatever. It was called gay pride.
It was gay.
Yeah, exactly. It was gay. It was just basically an excuse for gay men who had been putting a lot of hard work throughout the year in the gym to get those shirts off and get their boobies out and to show off their body and hypersexualize, which I'm all for. I'm all for hypersexualizing spaces, but it's supposed to be an inclusive space, right? It's supposed to be LGBTQIA+, and not everyone was included or welcome in those spaces. So it goes to show it's something that we may not realize in the beginning, but gay people, it's not, you don't have to punish yourself for that. You just have to acknowledge how you basically monopolize that movement, and maybe step back sometimes and let other people like come in and talk.
Samir, how do you feel about this exactly? How, like, you've been in Lebanon and you're now outside of Lebanon. Like, what is the difference that you see in this community within Lebanon and outside of it?
I think I can only bring the Eastern European perspective, right? From that sense, as I live here, and from what you observe in general, is also quite linked to a region, to a geographic region as well, because there's a lot of geopolitical aspects that also link to the type of messages that you see in the news, the type of like the culture in general, and the openness and the proximity. And I think Lebanon so far has managed to be one of the most liberal, I would say, countries when it comes to LGBT expression, etc. Unfortunately, it goes in two ways, right? I mean, when you turn on the TV, the local television, you would see a very unfortunate representation of the LGBT community, right? Whereas on the ground, you see like a more realistic and very organized, I would say, approach towards queer voices, very legitimate demands, etc., etc. When it comes to being in Eastern Europe, actually, Ukraine is considered also among the very progressive countries when it comes to LGBT rights, and that also links to their 2014 revolution, where they went pro-European and pro-human rights in general and democracy, which means that before 2014, the pride being organized in Kiev was something extremely dangerous to think of, whereas just recently there was a pride being organized, and there are reports that there have been law enforcement officers that have over-exceeded the march protesters themselves on the ground just to protect the pride from any harm. So it really links to a political transformation and the desire of people to want, to live in freedom and in all aspects of a democratic state. So indeed, I think a future outcome for Lebanon could indeed be a strong and just system and institutions that protect all its people, all citizens, when they want to assemble, when they want to unite, when they want to protest, and at the same time delivers according to the demands. We are far behind when it comes to the government delivering upon and seeing these needs and demands on the ground. And I think we have a wonderful and cute guest here.
Yeah, I was gonna say, so cute.
Dog. It's a dog.
Just to say that it gets there. I'm very optimistic in general because we know oppression has an expiry date. It doesn't last. People are meant be free. People are meant to thrive in freedom and equality and openness, and we cannot repress for long. The day will come for all Lebanese to be able to enjoy their rights equally, and this is a course that will be decided by the Lebanese themselves. And I think the elections now are a turning point indeed, for that to take place.
Sandra, I wanted to ask you about the impact of this community on the coming elections, like the support that they might need, the impact that they might have on the change in the coming elections, the system, everything. Like, how is it from your side?
I really think when it comes to the queer community, I think we're not as easily manipulated, hopefully. I hope so, because at the end of the day, our aim is to lobby for queer rights, and that automatically means lobbying for basic rights and human rights at the core. And this is something that is not present in any way in our current government, or the government that's been there for the past 30 years. So I don't know. I really think we have. I really think the queer vote can make a difference this time. Very honestly, we're all going to be lobbying. I'm going to do everything I can to push people to vote.
Are there any candidates
No.
that you feel like could be representative of the queer voice?
For me personally, it's not just about a queer voice. There isn't really any alternative to the existing parties. I know by the elections are in the coming months. By this time, we're supposed to be very aware of who's running, what's their agenda, what are their politics. There's nothing of the sort. Yeah. Even if we had some hope in the civil society, nothing actually. There was nothing.
I would argue that I would be a little bit more optimistic on the side of civil society and independent representation in the current elections. I think in general, indeed, there's a lot of delay in campaigning that we're witnessing, but the bottom side of the iceberg is already there. There's a lot of discussions happening among these people, whether they're organized or not. It's a different issue. But to answer you shortly, Riwa, on the issue of fair representation of the queer community. Well, first of all, we need queer people to run for elections, so that for it to be a very fair, I would say, election process and representation of the queer community, and then you have other options and other alternatives, which is the queer issues being a cross-cutting issue within the program and parliamentary program of each candidate in general, or the political parties. In recent years, and this has also been exploited for more vote gains at the same time. A party claiming that, we are now LGBT progressive, and we would because they start realizing that we cannot move forward without this group of people, without this community. We are not moving forward, and they need minimum, openness towards these people, because they know that we might sabotage their plans if we're just not happy with their elections, even if we vote for them in general. Now,
are there any parties at all that have been openly supportive of the queer community?
In the past, yes, there were a lot of the political parties that have been in government for years, that when elections come, this is suddenly part of their agenda.
So since some of the parties in Lebanon that are actually big parties, some of the bigger parties, so they had a specific part of their agenda specific for the queer community, which is something that Miquel already pointed out to me before, that sometimes the political parties or political figures, they go through the whole tokenism. So, Miquel, could you please explain further how the tokenism thing works? How can a person point that out and say, this is tokenism, this is not actual representation? Because I think in Lebanon, this is still a very new concept. So, yeah, go ahead.
So basically, tokenism is when you get a particular person that represents a niche or a segment of society that you want to represent in your party, but without actually giving them any real power, any real say in the development of the political program of your party. So like imagine that you want to say, well, we're all for gay rights, right? And then you have only one person in the front line of your party who's gay, but it doesn't really have that much power. He's in the sidelines, and then he's not really doing anything much. That would be considered tokenism, like representation, but without any. That representation is not really revolutionary because it doesn't change the established political rules or presence of that minority in power, right? Like Thatcher would be considered tokenistic. I would consider Thatcher tokenistic of a woman's of female politicians, right? Because she was the only female politician within her party, within her cabinet, for example, right? And she actively tried to not get women integrated within her cabinet because she thought that women were more emotional. They didn't know how to handle things well. So that she had integrated and internalized all those stereotypes about women. So I wouldn't consider Thatcher like a feminist, like empowerment figure. I would consider her a token. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So that's that kind of thing, right? Like a tokenistic representation would also be having like someone black in your party because it's like fashionable. It's like cool to be like anti-racist or be like a variety of pigmentation, right, in your party, but then not really tackling racism or tackling any like structural racism in your country, right? Some people called Kamala Harris, for example, like a tokenistic representation of a black woman because a lot of people in the black community didn't think that she represented the best interest or she cared about, for example, the black women, right? So I feel like it's usually the community itself where that tokenistic person came from that call it out. Usually, same with like it has to do with pink washing, for example. Like so many companies that are like during Pride Week, they're like, oh yes, we're all for gay rights, and they paint all their products in a rainbow color, and they're always like gay. They love to use gay, I don't know, like cultural figures as well to like represent their products during that week. But then, as soon as that week ends, they strip all their colors down, and then you have a leak like a week later saying Coca-Cola funded anti-gay political party blank. You know what I mean? It's like it's an example. It's not grounded in reality, but you know what I mean? That would be a tokenistic representation as well.
Miquel, I got a follow-up question for you. Based on that, especially from your individual experience, my question also links as well to labor rights to a certain extent, because a lot of the rights that many laborers and workers in general have acquired is thanks to organization and forming, labor unions, specific organization mechanisms in general. How do you describe the organizational aspect of sex workers and gay sex workers, I would say, as well in Catalonia? And then how and do you feel it's something that is necessary to move the agenda forward?
Yeah, I'm part of a sex worker-led organization called Otras, which is an organization of sex workers of Spain. That would be the translation. And I am the local Mallorcan delegate. And I'm also part of international relations. So I'm linked with decriminalization movements in Victoria, for example, where they're decriminalizing sex work right now, and New York as well, where they have a very big social justice component. And I think it's like an intersectional and wide-ranging movement as well, because it incorporates so many different aspects, right? Like sex worker rights are also LGBT rights, are also labor rights, are also migration rights, are also refugee rights. So it's wide encompassing, and also it's now we're starting to get a lot of mobilization because the abolitionist branch of the government right now doesn't have enough support to, like, for example, criminalize the client, because they said they wanted to like abolish prostitution by criminalizing the client, and then the issue is over, right? And we went to Congress and we talked to like all the different parties that are represented in the Congress, and we actually told them this is what's going to happen. We want labor rights. We just want because it's not going to affect me, as I said before, because I'm a male sex worker and no one's going to look for me. And the laws don't even apply to me, because the law that they want to pass says women and girls. So they're basically, what they actively and actually criminalizing is female prostitution, which is always going to affect the people in the street more, because like the street sex workers are the most visible, they're the most accessible to the police, and trans sex workers as well, and migrant sex workers, because those are the oppressed communities that usually have the worst experience with the police, and they're always finding excuses. Sometimes like anti-trafficking laws are applied as anti-immigration laws, so they actively try to conflate people who come here illegally as victims of trafficking, because they want an excuse to kick them out, right? So now I feel like joining a union is crucial, regardless of what space of society you occupy or what job you hold. I think that's basic. Like mobilization is crucial, and also like inter-movement solidarity as well. I'm not saying like to blend everything together. It has to be like a clear separation, but also like sometimes getting together, like getting like anti-racism movements and getting criminalization of the migrant movements and labor movements, and then LGBT movements and sex worker movements. They're all together in the same, they're looking for the same thing. And I feel like the liberation of a single movement is the liberation of every movement, right? It serves a higher purpose. So that's what we're trying to do now. Like we're trying to like build like solidarity between movements. And that's why I think it's very interesting to build ties with unlikely countries such as Lebanon, because I feel like in the end, this is an international movement.
Absolutely, Miquel. And I think that's also another follow-up question that I would have at this moment, which links as well to the globalization of the movement, right? The globalization of the demand of becoming this union of sex workers, for example, that actually belongs to or holds very legitimate demands in general. And these demands are universally challenged, I would say. So this also reminds me of, for example, the Black Lives Matter movement that became globalized, from one incident, really started thriving in different capitals, across different cities across the world, etc., as a universal struggle, structural, institutional, racism, etc. And here we're talking about also structural and institutional and systemic homophobia, transphobia, sex phobia to a large extent as well.
In general,
To what extent do you think this one is feasible? What would be the best way to achieve that globalization of the universal revendication of rights?
Yeah, I feel like there's definitely a global trend that's headed that way. I feel like as with any movement that seeks the liberation of a specific movement, of a specific segment of the population, there's always going to be like regressive and anti that movement, because there's always going to be a group of people that think that bigger and more rights for some people is going to mean less rights for them, right? So there's always going to be like an action and a reaction. But I feel like, as I said, solidarity among movements and stopping the bickering between, like different organizations that might have the same end goal, but they might have different approaches on how to get there. It's crucial. And also, like, as I said, I feel like sex work is like one of the things that is wide encompassing. And that's why I'm not only focused on that, because I'm also like, I would consider myself an LGBTQIA plus activist. And it also touches on so many things like personal freedom. We all hate the police. We all hate the police. It's true. We don't want a greater police surveillance in our communities. I don't think that's something that any queer person wants. We want social justice. We want an end to discrimination of all sorts. We want the dismantlement of the imperialistic policies that are lingering from, like the age of the British Empire. And it's still like, I wouldn't, like, for example, like in Japan, I don't think, in Japan, they're very homophobic. They're very internalized and externalized homophobia. But they had a very widespread queer culture before they had to open up to the Americans and the British. Or India as well, they had a huge, widely encompassing and very inclusive LGBT community until the British went there and fucked it up. And they still have so many like British laws integrated within their penal system. So I feel like we have to acknowledge imperialism and colonization as part of the struggle, and we have to decolonize ourselves as well. And it's something that Spanish people struggle as well, because even though they might be very progressive, they're always they tend to have this very paternalistic approach to people who are not their same race, right? And that also plays into the struggle of domination, because you might be a trans woman, a Spanish trans woman, that might be more privileged than, I don't know, like a bisexual cis woman of color that comes from another place and doesn't have a nationality. And those are things that are not acknowledged in Spain as well.
Miquel, let's picture that you. Sorry, I'm bombarding you now with questions because that's extremely interesting, important. I would say. Let's picture now one of the viewers is actually, this young man who wants actually to follow a similar, I would say, either career path or like economic ambitions. What comes to that? What piece of advice would you tell them? What challenges should they anticipate from where they stand in their part of the world? That's a very challenging question, I know. Challenges do they have to anticipate standing there and then picturing that this is actually a choice they want to make? They want to be generating income from something that they enjoy, which is sex work in general, and then this also links with their identity, which is also connected to a certain social stigma and like a whole process at the same time. So, what advice would you tell them?
Well, my first advice would be don't come to my city because I don't want any more competition. Second of all, no, but like really, like what I would say would be to be prepared to make difficult life choices, because not everyone has a strong life support system, as in like friends and family that might be supportive. That then you have to add different intersections, right? You have to add different intersections that might not apply to me because I'm a white gay guy and that has the nationality of the country that he resides in. So I'm not a migrant, right? So let's say it's a gay Lebanese guy who wants to work in, no, maybe not Lebanon, but maybe wants to go to different places, right? Well, he will have to face an uphill battle. It's less of an uphill battle if you do sex work, because I don't like calling it empowering. I would like to call it's empowering as in the sense that it allows you to generate income, right? With any other job, but you get more income compared to the labor of your sexuality, I guess. But yeah, if you go to another place, they're going to treat you like a migrant. They're always going to have stereotypes thrown at you. You're going to have to like face like housing discrimination, and there's something that you have to be aware of. For instance, I started doing it when I was in London. I was London back then was still part of the EU, so I was not a foreigner in the strictest sense of the word, because I could just get my ID and travel from Catalonia there. But you have a lot of migrants who incorporate sex work in their migration journey, right? In the migratory path. And it's something that people don't tend to understand because they think of it as degrading. But it's when you're a migrant, your work choices are greatly reduced because you might not be able to work legally. So you go to you might be a doctor, you might be a scientist back in your home country, but then you have to leave either by force, and you're a refugee. When I was working in Thailand for 6 months in an LGBT organization. And we had to deal with a lot of like LGBTQIA plus refugees that had dabbled in sex work in order to fund or be able to survive their journeys, right? So it's a very intricate part of the migration stories of a lot of people. But then, even though that's what it took for them to survive, afterwards they get stigmatized and blamed for it back in their home communities, and they might lose sight or contact with their parents and their siblings because they cannot bear the burden of shame they have put on their shoulders, you know what I mean? So it's sometimes in life you have to make difficult choices, I would tell them. But I think in the end it pays off. And in the end, it's an empowered decision because you could end up doing, you might stay home because you're too ashamed of taking that step. But you know what I mean? But I feel like in the end it pays off.
That's a very important point you bring here, and just because people don't see them every day doesn't mean they don't exist.
They're so you're surrounded by them. This is the thing. This is something that I've learned being in the youth wings of many political parties, because I do some I teach about sex worker rights, formations for individual parties. And in the end, sometimes people come to me and they're like, I didn't ever told this to anyone, but I'm a sex worker. I'm doing sex work because I want to fund my university. And it might be maybe out of 10 people, 2 or 3 come to me, you know what I mean? So it's do people know about this? And they're like, no, I'm too ashamed. But 3 people came to me. Talk to each other, talk about your experiences, and then talk to your friends about it. It's going to be difficult, but then in the end, it's going to be better for you. And it's about survival, and it's about managing to taking the tools that you have right now and making the best out of it. You know what I mean? And it's you'd be surprised at the amount of people that do it, especially in the LGBT community. It's massive. You're surrounded, especially if you're on Grindr. You're gonna have strangers that are gonna be talking to you and saying, "Oh yeah, I would like fetishes, right? They're into feet or they're into pay, and they offer you money to do that." And you know what I mean? And you have to pay for for rent, and you have to pay for maybe for a trip when you're traveling. You're a refugee. You need to pay for a traveling fare, and you have to make that choice. And it's something that people don't talk about because of shame. You know what I mean? So I feel like it's just, empower yourself however you can and fuck society. It's as simple as that. I would never want to criminalize. I don't want to criminalize survival. You're basically criminalizing survival. Women always suffered more. That's what I mean. Trans women suffer more than trans men, and then black, black women always face it harder than black men. This is something that we cannot deny or overlook. It's something that's true. So male sex workers are actually never going to be criminalized, and that actually benefits us because our invisibilization is power, because we're men and we depart from a position of power. We part from a position of power, and the laws are always against female sex workers, either explicitly so, like in Spain, that they want to pass and they're not going to pass because they don't have the votes. Or in Japan as well. In Japan, for example, vaginal sex is criminalized in the sense of within the context of sex work. If you engage in monetary transaction for penetrative vaginal sex, that's criminalized. But then the rest is not. So giving a blowjob for money is legal.
Of course, we always have the responses towards or even the thoughts that relate to the queer community. They're always backed up by religion, almost all the negative ones. We've seen that many times with the comments on our post for this session specifically. So if it were to happen that the governmental system in the countries, if it were to change from a religious-based kind of government to a secular one, do you think that it would impact as much, or do you think that it needs a more radical change related to society?
Definitely, I think it's a very valid question, and I would say moving indeed from a confessional state towards a secular state, secular government in general, rules out the idea that citizens are different based on their religion, right? We treat people differently based on what religious school they belong to, or whether they do or whether they don't. The whole idea of a secular state is that everyone is treated equally in front of the law, and the entire background of the moral arguments that people and institutions have against specific groups, and this falls. This just falls. And what we need is a secular state that looks at people equally, with differentiating men, women, LGBT, sex workers, whatever citizens wish to or belong to in general. Having this fair and strong institutions that actually respond to the needs and to the rights of these groups in their diversity at the end of the day. So a secular state, definitely, as we've seen what religion has done globally and locally in the country, we know that it doesn't succeed. To the contrary, more harm than good in governance. So definitely separation of state and religion, religious affairs. And this is, again, something that the Lebanese people will have to decide for themselves. And it doesn't make you any less religious if you're in a secular state. At the end of the day, a secular state would also respect your freedom of belief, being the religion or whatever you believe in general. And just being secular makes us just all equal in front of the law, right? And doesn't segregate us based on our religious belongings or identification in general, right?
With just moving away from religious states, you're opening more room for self-expression. You're opening more room for it's not even just queer at this moment. Yani, for me, civil marriage is something we need to look into here. We need to look into a bunch of stuff that religion stands in the way of.
The way the country is currently structured, I would say, nothing can hold religious institutions accountable for the propaganda and for the hate messages that are being promoted across the local and churches, etc. So we have documented instances where the church has publicly, denounced or advocated against, the promotion of queer or LGBT, as if it's a product that you promote,
There was حتى here in Lebanon, sorry Sam to interrupt you, a couple of years ago, the whole Mashrou' Layla thing and the whole thing that happened here.
And that is openly, where the members are openly gay, where, in a nationalistic, religious, pro-Christian group would just go and stop a private concert that is taking place, where people actually pay to go and watch. And even if it was public, you can just not go, and that is it. That's the maximum you can do. You cannot stop thousands of people wanting to go, consciously making the conscious decision to go there, just because you have different beliefs. And that's absolutely outrageous. And in a secular state, this would be illegal. And these people would actually be questioned, for their behavior. In general, whereas for religious state that is religious leaning, you will always have the religious argument and the moral argument winning over, the civil liberties and public liberties in general.
Which takes me back to a subject that was previously discussed on a previous episode, which is the limit that should be drawn on freedom of speech and freedom of expression. And
sorry, let me stop it here because I think limit and freedom do not meet at all. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
yes.
There is no limit to freedom of expression. You express yourself.
Yes.
You're not hurting anybody. At least, and people can choose to change channels, to tune somewhere else. Just like the radio. The radio offers you a diversity of stations. If you're listening to something you don't like, or you're watching something you don't like, you just zap, and that's it. You don't go and you shut down the radio station just because you believe in something different. Because other people have a different opinion, and your opinion is nothing compared to the mass. Normally, the way I express myself, you're entitled to also express yourself, to convey a discussion, to dialogue, right, and to bridge opinions. And we can agree to disagree, and that would be it. But the cancel culture is not something that works in a democracy and should never be part of any democracy in general. Canceling a certain culture, a certain way of living, just because I believe, that things should be living differently. And it all evolves around the concept of harm and violence. So of course, this needs to also be, we need to be very critical about how a functioning democracy is at the same time. It cannot be an incubator for violence and for extremism and radicalism at the same time. So there needs to be processes to encourage dialogue and exchange in general in opinions and belief. the specific Mashroul Leila case, the best case scenario would be a counter concert. You believe in, this is against, breaching your religious values. You just throw a counter concert, taking place maybe at the same time in a different location, etc., just to express yourself. And that's reciprocity. But you do not go and call on the cancellation of a public / private event, and just because you just disagree with what's being said in general. But
and put out death threats, Samir, and they put out death threats. They called them in for questioning.
Absolutely, and that's the violence brought into perspective. This is completely disproportional. It also counters the beliefs that they're advocating for at the end of the day. So it's just yeah. And in a secular state, we would not have to deal with that, because all opinions would be welcome.
How do you think the international community or the local community in the diaspora can at this point support the local community? And what is it that the local community can convey to the international community to bridge whatever existing gaps that we have at the moment?
I would say Lebanon today, more than ever, is enjoying, enjoying is not necessarily the right word, but does have established international partners that have had an international presence in the country through different systems, including the UN system, the EU, EUS presence, etc., etc. What does that mean in practice? This also means that the NGO environment, but also the public service environment that is being supported by international partners, could also dedicate a specific envelope and specific resources being dedicated to the queer and LGBT community programming in specific. And not only when it comes to the non-profit industry, but also for be it a binding and mandatory, I would say, within the government structures at the same time. So normally when you're an international partner coming within big envelope for a country in general, you can have prerequisites or certain conditionality for the funding that is going on. And I think one thing that the international community, with its presence and influence in Lebanon at this stage, could do is to make these resources, allocate resources that are conditional to the support of the queer community, but also to the other marginalized groups. So more funding is necessary from Lebanon's international partners, more solidarity coming from Lebanon's diaspora towards the Lebanese and the refugees, etc., themselves, because many of the Lebanese outside Lebanon have a broader perspective towards the needs in Lebanon. They don't necessarily only look at the needs of the Lebanese, but also are sympathetic with the needs of Palestinians, of Syrians, of refugees in general, from a global perspective. So the international solidarity movements should be more present. And thankfully, thanks to big support of the diaspora, the Queer Relief Fund that was led by Sandra and her team was actually supported and funded and continues perhaps to be the case. Sandra can elaborate on that. So this whole solidarity effort also by pan-Arabs, so by other Arab countries for queer communities in Lebanon in general, but also by non-Lebanese, non-Arab in general, people could also be contributing to that. In different ways. But most importantly, for all the resources being channeled into the country by Lebanon's top international partners, for them to include in multi-year assistance that is flexible and that is strictly conditional within the general programming, but also to a strict category going to the queer community in Lebanon as well. That would be helpful.
Can I just mention something very quickly? Yeah. That from our labor union, because we didn't get, because sex work is not recognized in Spain, right? We don't have a right to like a pension. We don't have a right to like unemployment benefits. So during COVID, like a lot of people from the union struggled a lot, especially women, right? Like migrant women, because they cannot access even like benefits that I could access. And they basically, our labor union through like started a GoFundMe, and a lot of like an international support poured in, and we managed to raise like 50,000 euros, and we managed to like pay for a lot of people's rent, a lot of people's like. So I feel like there's a parallel there that's very, that that's very poignant and very, very prescient, right? Basically, like that sometimes people surprise you in a positive way, that you managed to get successful, because we didn't think we were gonna get anything
Listen,
out of it.
Like even us, like the Queer Relief Fund, because it was really just came out after the explosion, and at that point to go through the legalities of forming an actual company / NGO or whatever was impossible at the time, especially with the emotional trauma we were all dealing with. We went through the GoFundMe route actually, and that's how we raised funds. And to be very honest, like if you want to talk about the international community, during that period, if it was not for the international community and the friends that we have from the queer communities abroad, we wouldn't have been able to do this. Like, and it wasn't just like Lebanese diaspora, because I also work in entertainment and culture within the community. So a lot of contacts that I've made through the years were actually helped out a lot and actually helped spread the word. So to be very honest, like at that point in time and ever since, I've really felt that the queer community was actually a global family, So, and that feeling has never gone away.
Yeah, exactly. I would say the same thing about like other sex work organizations around the world, literally.
Yeah, you feel like you have a family wherever you go. Just
exactly.
So
it's a horrible thing to like go through like that kind of trauma, but there's also a silver lining that it makes you your ties are stronger, right?
For sure.
And then you have to like make your own personal assessment of if it's been, of course it hasn't been worth it, but what can you take out of that experience?
Of course, and you grow and you learn new things, and then you also learn to appreciate the people in your life, even if you never thought, even if these people never even crossed your mind,
It's been such a good session. I really don't want to wrap it up. Does anyone want to wrap it up?
I have to go.
Well, it's 9. I have dinner, honey. I have to nourish this body.
Darling,
it's 11
almost
here.
11.
It's 11.
I know, it's okay. So it's like.